welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. In this episode, we're going to take a hard look at the just concluded two-day mini ministerial of the WTO at the capital, New Delhi. Admittedly, these are harsh times for global trade, and with Donald Trump continuing to remain unglued, as it were, one really does not know where the headwinds will be and whether there will be any tailwinds at all for global trade. And who better to answer those questions for us than two of the best brains on global trade whom we have with us here in the studio. We have with us Abhijit Das, Head WTO Center in Indian Institute of International Trade, New Delhi, and also T.S. Vishwanath, former colleague and presently Principal Advisor, APG SLJ Law Advisors. Welcome to the show, Abhijit, Vishi. Well, let me start off by asking both of you, or rather each of you in turn, what were your expectations really before the mini ministerial? And have those expectations been belied? Have they been lived up to? Or have they been exceeded? Let me start with you, Abhijit.
Mythili, Commerce Minister Mr. Suresh Prabhu said very clearly, and rightly so, that we did not have any specific agenda before the mini ministerial. This was more an occasion where ministers would break ice amongst themselves and try to discuss in a free and frank atmosphere how to take discussions forward on issues where we could not get any convergence, where we could not get any agreement at the December Buenos Aires Ministerial Conference. So from that perspective, very fact that ministers and very high-level policymakers from more than 50 countries came to India gives a very clear signal that multilateralism is still important. It may not be very vibrant, but it cannot be relegated to the background. And countries put considerable store in multilateralism. And that, I think, was the real outcome of this mini ministerial. And with that perspective in mind, I think India has done a very commendable job of providing a platform for further discussions and also signaling to the world that perceptions that India is a no-sayer, India is a deal breaker may perhaps be highly exaggerated.
Would you agree with that assessment, Vishwanath? Because all said and done, yes, it's good we're talking, but ultimately at the end of the day, we have to see some action as well. So is mere lip service enough? Agreed, expectations were never very high, but is this good enough considering we've been talking about the DDA now for so many years? The Doha development round hasn't really gone anywhere. Vishwanath?
Well, Mythili, I think the fact that the DDA has seriously not moved ahead has been the reason for that. I think has been we have a lot on the plate in terms of the DDA. But more importantly, I think in the last few years, and especially in Buenos Aires, we found that a lot of issues which were already on the table and which needed a conclusion just did not move forward. So taking forward what I think Mr. Das said a little while back in terms of the mini ministerial, actually has, I think, been able to bring back that hope that we can move the Doha round forward. Because if we don't conclude the Doha round and we don't do anything on the Doha round, I don't think there is much that's going to happen in terms of the multilateral trade organization like a WTO being able to move on lots of issues. I think there are lots of challenges that the WTO today faces, and I think for that there is a need to ensure that all countries get around and complete the Doha round, which needs to be done as quickly as we can.
Well, it's good to know that both of you are so very optimistic, and it's good to be hopeful. But at the end of the day, what Roberto Azevedo did say is that he did not rule out retaliation, and he also spoke of the possibility of trade wars. Agreed, most people said it's a very extreme kind of scenario and it's very unlikely. But for the first time, we are hearing somebody in a very responsible position talk of trade wars. So would you still remain optimistic, Abhijit?
Mythili, we need to bear a couple of important points in mind. At this juncture, the US is more or less isolated given its recourse to the security exception for enhancing tariffs on steel and aluminium. And what this mini ministerial meeting has done, if we look at the chair's summary, what this mini ministerial meeting has done is help to consolidate the views around the need to strengthen multilateralism. And as part of the mini ministerial, of course, we wouldn't know who said what, but the chair's summary does indicate that some countries in their interventions highlighted the importance of the WTO membership taking A, urgent, and B, coordinated action to address the underlying issues. In other words, they do realize that the vicious cycle of action by US and counteraction by other countries will do no good to anyone. It will harm US, it will harm the other countries, it will harm the multilateral trading system. So it's best not to engage in that type of a downward spiral. So what can the members do? I think there are many options which can emerge, and those options will emerge by talking together. We do have a very important precedent when in 2001, President Bush did something very similar. And again, the lobby group was steel. President Bush had imposed safeguard measure on steel. He had brought into place something called the Byrd Amendment, and he had started discussions at the OECD on cutting steel subsidies. Now, on the first two issues, a large number of developing countries and developed countries came together. They jointly lodged a dispute against US on the Byrd Amendment as well as on the steel safeguard tariffs. And that really forced the US to perhaps get back in line with the WTO rules. I think if that precedent is kept in mind, if some countries take the leadership, perhaps a coordinated action by even a dozen countries should give a very clear, strong message to the US that if it wants to benefit from the multilateral trade rules, it better play by the rules of the game. Otherwise, maybe some more serious action could be taken by the countries against the US. And that's a very important political message which needs to be delivered. And it is such platforms such as the mini ministerial meeting where I'm sure this message would have gone out from most of the participating countries to the US delegation.
Well, that would be a good message to send, all right. But Vishy, I'm a little skeptical about whether the rest of the world can really take on the might of the US. And remember, Donald Trump is very different from Bush. All said and done, he's far more irrational, if I were to put it that way. So can one really hope to isolate the US and get away with it? Because we've seen the US pull out of the TPP, and even though the other countries are trying to go ahead, can one really succeed in something like this, in trade negotiations, without the elephant in the room, really, Vishy?
Obviously, no. I mean, if you ask me, I don't. I mean, I would have a slightly different view than what Mr. Das has, in the sense that because I look at it from a very industry perspective, and looking at it from an industry perspective, I would think that instead of taking on the US head on, what I would seriously look for is a far higher engagement with the US. Because frankly, there is a lot of protectionism that has grown in the last 6 months to a year. We have seen it not just from the US. US, of course, has been the leader as always in this area. But the fact is that there have been a lot of other countries. What the reason why Brexit happened, there have been tariffs which have been raised even by India. So there has been a lot of protectionism that has been happening across the globe. But I think what we seriously need to do at the multilateral level is to start looking at issues which impact business. While WTO till now has seriously looked at issues which are at the policy level because it's a government-to-government body, but we need to start looking at issues which are very business-oriented, and that's why I think from a very business perspective, the fact that there are other issues which are coming up like e-commerce or an MSME need a close look, and I think that's something which the mini ministerial said that it was willing to start looking at some of those issues. And I think we need to start engaging on them. The fact is that there are two different things. One, we need to ensure that the Doha round has a conclusion. We can't bring in new issues till the Doha round is concluded. So let's first quickly resolve what's there on the table, whatever are the pending issues on Doha round, we need to resolve it, and then we move on to issues which impact business. Because if it does not really impact business, then the use of a WTO would start waning as we go along because of the huge rise of FTAs that have happened across the globe. I think there is a change in the way WTO is looked at thanks to the FTAs that have come up, and I think we need to recognize that.
Abhijit, would you agree with Vishwanathan that he raised two very important points? One, he said that WTO is increasingly should be more about business to business rather than government to government and policy issues, which to my mind seems, I'm not entirely convinced to be honest, because to my mind it is essentially about governments negotiating with inputs from industry. So I want your reaction first to that. And second, to the point that he made, that we need to conclude all the things that were on the Doha round and then move on to the new area, new issues. Whereas this is precisely what gives India the image of being a spoiler. The rest of the world seems to suggest that India is always resisting the inclusion of new issues. And the point really is that it's all very well for us to say no, but it's better for us to be within the WTO framework and then argue against these new issues or argue to get these new issues the way we want them to go rather than just saying no. So I want your reaction to the two very important issues that Vishwanath raised.
Thanks, Mythili. Let's bear in mind that at the end of the day, the WTO rules are not to be seen in a vacuum or in isolation. They are actually about business, but the governments have the responsibility of reconciling interests of different parts of the economy, between industry and agriculture, within industry, upstream industry, interests of downstream industry. So it is really about business, no doubt, but business in terms of a coherent, harmonized picture which takes forward the government policies, and hence it's the governments which are on the negotiating table. So the rules which have been negotiated in the past have really been about business. For example, the rules on intellectual property rights as contained in the TRIPS agreement were really the rules that were pushed by the big pharma of US. Similarly, the rules on services contained in GATS, these were pushed by financial services. So to say that WTO rules may not be too much about business may not be a right perception. These are about business, and even the future rules which might get crafted, which might get negotiated, let's say on MSMEs or electronic commerce, they certainly will be about business, no doubt. But then it will be the governments who will be charged, who will be responsible for negotiating the rules, with of course inputs from different stakeholders, from different segments of the economy, from different players at different value chains. So the short point I'm trying to make is that these rules have been about business and they will continue to remain about business even in the future. Now on the point what Vishwanath mentioned about concluding the Doha round, I fully agree with him. That has been India's position, and that is a very rational, logical position. We should never be afraid of saying no if it does not suit our interests. And let me give you some reasons why India has been at the forefront of championing the Doha round and saying that please conclude Doha round first. Then we are open to taking up new issues. Number one, the Doha round was launched and it was conducted in accordance with ministerial declarations and decisions which were taken by consensus. And if a handful of countries now are of the view that Doha round is no longer relevant and let's abandon Doha round, then where is the sanctity of such ministerial declarations and decisions? And even if in future we start a new round of trade negotiations, would countries like India or other developing countries have the certainty, have the assurance that other players will not move away from the negotiating table if the outcome of the negotiations seems to be going against their interest? So just purely from the systemic perspective, it really makes very good sense to conclude Doha round first and thereafter get into a new round with new issues. And let me just remind our viewers here that based on the statement which India made at the mini ministerial meeting yesterday, the statement is in public domain now. India has not said that we will not engage in new issues. India has said three things. A, convince us that these new issues are trade related. B, negotiating rules which are binding at the WTO in these areas such as MSMEs or electronic commerce or investment facilitation are in the benefit of developing countries. And C, countries like India and all other developing countries will have access to special and differential treatment. Convince us on these 3 points. we are ready to engage. So
Okay.
that should allay fears that India is a naysayer.
And then we're willing. Oh, okay, it should allay fears, but I'm afraid it's time for us to slip into a very short break. So please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and I'm in discussion with Abhijit Das and T.S. Vishwanath on the broad conclusions that we can draw from the just concluded mini ministerial of the WTO in the capital. Vishwanath, before the break, both you and Abhijit were in agreement that India is not a spoiler and that we are willing to discuss the new issues provided certain conditions are met. Now, the three new issues that India and the rest of the world really are talking in the context of the WTO talks are really e-commerce, investment and trade facilitation, and the MSME. In the context of e-commerce, is it not better that we go by certain standard rules rather than wait for these rules to be thrust upon them, particularly given the fact that there are a number of developing countries, mind you, which do want these rules to be brought in for e-commerce as well and do want e-commerce brought in. So what should our position be, and why is it that we are not very happy to have e-commerce discussed at this particular juncture? Vishwanath?
I'm not sure if India is averse to e-commerce being discussed at the WTO. I think what India is averse to is e-commerce becoming a part of the discussions at present at Doha round. But having said that, Mythili, what I would seriously want to move forward is to say that e-commerce is all about business. Certainly, the rules there have to be, which have to come up from each government, rather than we come up with international rules first and then we start adopting it at the national level. And for this, I think we seriously need to do some thinking internally in terms of what kind of rules does India really want on e-commerce. When we talk about rules on e-commerce, I think there is a bit of a confusion as to what exactly is e-commerce and what is it that we are trying to make rules on. I think nobody in the industry segment or among a lot of other stakeholders seriously know what is it that's going to get discussed at the WTO on e-commerce. I think the first thing which the proponents need to start talking about is what is it that we want to discuss at the WTO, what are the issues that are going to come up there. But I agree with you, Mythili, that the fact that we need to come up with our own rules, we need to come up with our own areas, because there are several areas. As of now, we seriously don't have any large Indian, e-commerce player here other than Amazon, Flipkart, which are not fully Indian as yet. But the fact is that we don't have very large, e-commerce players in India. So there is a need for the various ministries which are there, from an MSME to the DAITI, to Ministry of Commerce, to DIPP, to start sitting together and start saying how do we make rules for e-commerce in India before we even start negotiating it at the WTO.
Obviously, I would like to add to that, particularly because there are many developing countries who are quite happy to see e-commerce brought into the trade negotiations. So given that, should we not think in our own minds, think through what are the kind of rules that we'd like to see, which are the areas we want to focus on? So should we not be working on that, Abhijit?
I agree with you, Mythili. We should be working on the areas where we would like rules to come in. But let's also bear in mind that we already have the template of rules before us, the rules which might get negotiated. That template exists in terms of the rules on e-commerce as contained in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. In all likelihood, if negotiations at the WTO start on e-commerce, or in fact the entire gamut of digital economy, then it will be the TPP template which will be the basis for further negotiations. And that is where the problem is. At the heart of the e-commerce negotiations is likely to be a provision which will mandate countries to allow cross-border data flows. Now, if that happens, you can reasonably be certain that in most developing countries, as well as in large number of developed countries, the space for domestic firms in the digital arena to come up and get nurtured will get reduced to zero. Why do I say that? For two primary reasons. Data is the oil. It's a cliche now, but it's like most other cliches, it's a very true depiction of the reality. Those who have access to data, those who control data, will really control the global e-commerce. And linked with that is something called network effect. And linked with network effect is the reality that in the e-commerce sector, in the digital arena sector, those who are first movers get access to data, they create data, and based on that huge mass of data, they are able to become winners. And not only do they become winners, they are able to prevent fast followers from catching up. And the negotiations on e-commerce really, at the end of the day, is aimed at ensuring that the first mover advantage is frozen in time, the market power of the big digital giants is entrenched, gets further deepened, and new entities in a particular area have absolutely no chance of catching up. So is that the digital reality, digital future that we want for our country? I would say certainly no. The government must have the flexibility in future to nurture the domestic digital firms, to put in place, if need be, barriers to make sure that our digital firms grow, to make sure that we get a fair share of the pie in the digital economy in the future. And these can be achieved through implementing what I would call a digital industrial policy. But implementing a digital industrial policy becomes almost impossible if the type of rules which are contained in the TPP on e-commerce become the basis for negotiations at the WTO. Hence, I would be very, very hesitant to go down the path of India, or for that matter, larger developing countries engaging in the negotiations. Now, the point remains, why are developing countries, some of them at least, talking about negotiations? A brutal, frank answer: A, they are not aware of the implications. B, they have been misled. And combine the two, if they are explained in clear terms that yes, e-commerce is good for you as it is for India, but is negotiating binding rules on e-commerce good for the respective countries? Perhaps if the implications of negotiations are explained more clearly to the developing countries, you will certainly see a sea change. You will see the tide turning against the very fervent request by a large number of developing countries to initiate negotiations on e-commerce.
True. In fact, many of the inequities in the global trading system are precisely because developing countries never really knew what is really hitting them under the guise of negotiations. But Vishwanath, we're coming to the end of our discussion because we're running out of time. So very quickly on the issue of investment and facilitation of investment, given that we already allow national treatment, why are we so apprehensive about getting investment as part of trade negotiations? Because ultimately the fact is that with global supply chains, investment and trade are very closely interlinked. Vishwanath?
The fact is that the WTO is not a body that was supposed to deal with anything that is not exactly trade related. And I would beg to differ from you a little in terms of saying that investment is trade related, because investment can have a lot of other areas which is not exactly trade related. As long as it's investment facilitation, I think there is just no problem in terms of discussing it within the WTO framework. I think the problem that we seriously have is in just talking about rules for investment and other issues within the WTO framework. But having said that, just one point on the e-commerce, if you will just allow me, is the fact that I would say that, well, Abhijit said that we will have the TPP kind of template coming in for e-commerce. The fact is that I think what India needs to do, if it is very serious about this whole issue, is to come up with its own template. And I think if we can come up with our own template on what we want to negotiate at the e-commerce, then we can then have something in place of TPP. Rather than saying that we will not negotiate the e-commerce because there would be a TPP template, is not something which I would fully agree with.
Okay, so we're almost completely running out of time. So very quickly, if I could ask you to react to Mr. Azevedo's comment where he said that the WTO is not a sheriff for international trade. So we cannot really expect the WTO to come down very heavily on any kind of violations, as it were. Given the way the US is opposing appointment to the appellate body and Azevedo's comment, how hopeful are you of the WTO process, Abhijit, very quickly?
I still remain very hopeful. In the mini ministerial meeting, the chair's summary contains a very important sentence. We don't know which country made that sentence. What the sentence says is, what good is it really to talk about negotiating new trade rules when we are unable to even enforce the existing trade rules because of the problem in appellate body? This is a very serious problem. Members are extremely agitated about it, and there are ways of resolving the issue. And that really is at the heart of the multilateral trading system. Have a strong dispute resolution mechanism that ensures predictability, fair play, stability. And even United States realizes that. And over the next few months, we might see some moves happening from both sides to resolve these en passe.
Okay, would you second that, Vishwanath, that we still remain hopeful despite all the problems we are seeing now? Ultimately, our future lies in multilateral trade negotiations.
The fact is that the WTO has faced a lot of crises right from the time it has been born, and I think it has been able to overcome all of that crisis. And I'm sure that it would be able to overcome it because we seriously don't have an alternative to a multilateral system that can suit over 160 countries. So I think the WTO will continue to exist. What we have to ensure is that it remains robust. And I think something like the mini ministerial that India had would certainly help in that process.
Okay, well, on that rather optimistic note, let me thank you both, Abhijit as well as Vishwanath, for joining me in this discussion and passing down the impact of the mini ministerial and the outcome of the talks, how hopeful we could be, and the verdict clearly is we have every reason to be hopeful. Thank you very much, Abhijit and Vishwanath, once again. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.